think you're sick of the stormy winter months, spare a thought for our grounded seabirds. Don't forget, you can watch us live on Sky Channel 83 or Freeview Channel 50.
RNZ News at 5 o'clock. No mai haere mai. Good afternoon. Ko Sarah Bradley tēnei. The Housing Ministry has brought in a QC to investigate its complaint process following serious allegations about emergency housing in Rotorua. TVNZ's Sunday programme has raised concerns about a charitable housing service and the behaviour of security guards at its motels. The Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, says the matter was referred to the police. She says a QC also checked the ministry's complaints process was fit for purpose.
We do want to make sure that when people raise complaints that they are being looked at appropriately. People should be safe in their housing, particularly when it's provided by the government.
The QC's draft findings concluded that the ministry had taken reasonable steps based on the information it knew at the time. The government says gang members will no longer be able to hide their illegally acquired property. Police have new powers to seize assets valued at more than $30,000 from organised crime associates if it's suspected they weren't paid for through legal means. Justice Minister Kiri Allen says criminals are creating distance between themselves and their assets by putting property into associates' names.
If you're thinking about the gangsters that are driving around in the ill-gotten gains, you know, whether those big cars or the Harleys or whatnot, those bikes are expensive. Those cars are expensive. They I had a little look today, in excess of $40,000, $50,000. So you can be assured that those types of assets that we see plastered on the front page of the paper, those types of assets will be caught by this threshold.
The powers are expected to rake in $25 million a year. The Auckland University of Technology is considering cutting its early childhood centre, some courses and degrees, and up to 230 jobs. The university's Vice-Chancellor, Damon Salisa, says the university is facing rising costs and around 1,100 fewer students than expected this year.
The inflationary and the staffing cost pressures we're facing with that drop in student numbers means that we have to cut costs by about $21 million, which we're doing not just through staffing costs, but through savings in other areas as well.
Damon Salisa says the proposed cuts also reflect the fact students are choosing different courses. The Tertiary Education Union says it is bitterly disappointed by the plan. A man deported from Australia says 501 deportees are finding it nearly impossible to escape the cycle of crime. Police figures show that 2,758 deportees have arrived in New Zealand since 2015 and 57% of them have reoffended. When Makere Hutley arrived in 2016, he says he tried to start anew but ended up back in jail. Mr Hutley argues 501 deportees are mostly having to fend for themselves. And you can hear more of this story on Checkpoint shortly. Consumers say it's time the government regulates the retirement village sector. The Retirement Villages Association has announced a raft of voluntary reforms for its members, such as removing fees after a resident has died. But Fred Rood, whose mum lived in a retirement village until she passed away last year, says he doesn't trust the sector to self-regulate. After his mother's death, Mr Rood continued to pay for 6 months until the village found someone else to live in her unit. The exact amount of time the contract allowed it to charge for.
I think morally that's wrong, and my dear old mother would turn in her grave if she knew she had to part with all that cash. Really, it's just not fair.
Fred Rood says the retirement village sector had its chance to do better without government intervention, and it failed. Cabinet will consider any changes to the country's COVID-19 settings next Monday. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern says ministers will look at the latest public health advice and whether the traffic light framework is fit for purpose. She says they will also consider the current face mask requirements. To sport now, and the All Blacks will travel to Melbourne for their Bledisloe Cup clash against Australia without loose forwards Ardie Savea and Shannon Frizzell. Savea, who has been outstanding in an underperforming team this season, will remain at home for the birth of his third child, while Frizzell suffered a rib injury in Saturday night's win over Argentina. Luke Jacobson has been called into the squad as cover, with Hoskins Sututu the likely replacement for Savea for next week's clash against the Wallabies. Nick Kyrgios has crushed world number one Daniil Medvedev's dreams of a title defence at the US Tennis Open with a 4-set victory to advance to the quarterfinals in New York. Medvedev will now lose his number one ranking and says Kyrgios is playing at the level of Rafael Nadal and Novak Djokovic.
It was an amazing match. Obviously, Daniil is, defending champion. A lot of pressure on his shoulders, but I played really well. I've been playing amazing the last couple of months, but what a place to do it. Packed house in New York. I'm extremely blessed.
New Zealand driver Scott Dixon isn't confident about picking up another IndyCar title heading into the final round next week. Dixon finished third in today's penultimate round in Portland, with fellow New Zealander Scott McLaughlin winning and championship leader Will Power second. Power needs to finish in the top 3 to claim the title. McLaughlin's now 5th in the standings and also has an outside chance of winning the title. And that's the news.
Rolling the dice.
Up go the flags. Outstanding response under all sorts of pressure from the All Blacks.
Taking a gamble.
New Zealanders spend $1.5 billion a year on Lotto's gambling products, nearly double what they spent a decade ago.
And sometimes coming up a winner.
We're talking about 14 songs we hope to get.
I've got a feeling.
How many have we already recorded good enough? No.
You can bet on us. Morning Report, weekdays from 6 on RNZ National.
Lisa Owen and Checkpoint are next, but now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Warnings and watches are in place for heavy rain, strong winds and snow for parts of both the North and the South Island. For Northland to Whanganui, including Coromandel Peninsula and Bay of Plenty, rain heavy at times with possible thunderstorms north of Auckland, becoming fine early tomorrow. Gisborne, Hawke's Bay and the Central High Country, rain becoming heavy with snow lowering to 400 metres, easing to showers tomorrow morning and clearing tomorrow afternoon. Manawatu to Wellington and Wairarapa, rain with snow possible to 500 metres, easing overnight then clearing tomorrow morning. Marlborough and Canterbury, showers with snow to low levels, becoming fine north of Seddon this evening and elsewhere tomorrow morning. For Nelson, Buller and Westland, fine apart from isolated showers. Otago, Southland and Fiordland, showers, snow to low levels until tomorrow morning. And for the Chatham Islands, showers. You're listening to RNZ National at 7.5 minutes past 5. I'll have the headlines at 5:20.
Kia ora rā e ho. Tēnā koutou katoa, no mai haere mai ki Checkpoint e tēnei rā, ko Lisa Owen tēnei. A call tonight for an independent investigation into Rotorua's emergency housing train wreck, as it's described by Te Pāti Māori co-leader Rawiri Waititi. An investigation by TVNZ's Sunday programme has raised serious concerns about the substandard quality of the motel accommodation that's costing millions of dollars each week and the treatment and well-being of tenants. The MP for Wairiki says some of our most vulnerable are being put at risk of sexual, emotional and physical abuse. Ko taku manuhiri nai nei ko Rawiri Waititi. The Te Pāti Māori co-leader Rawiri Waititi joins us now. Tēnā koe.
Ai, tēnā koe, ho tēnā tātou.
Tell me, the Prime Minister and the Housing Minister basically say everything's ka pai, they've checked it out. What do you reckon?
Well, let's have the inquiry and make sure that inquiry is independent. And then we can make our and they can stand behind their words. But at this particular time, I would be very cautious about saying that everything is ka pai at this particular time after the expose on Sunday last night. We've always known that there were issues. I've actually stayed in one of those motels and have bear witness to some of the dysfunction in those hotels on Fenton Street. So I'm hearing people who live in Rotorua who live near Fenton Street, they are fearful And we've just got to start doing something about this. It's been 3 years now. There's been millions and millions of dollars spent in this particular space. Where's the light at the end of the tunnel for these people as they head into transitional housing? Emergency housing seems to be the go-to and the end of the road for many.
It's not an easy problem to fix, right? And one of the things that you're saying is that there should be no more emergency housing referrals. Do you mean just to Rotorua motels, or are you talking across the board?
Well, look, we need to start looking at where to from emergency housing situations across the country. But in particular, the expose here at Rotorua, and as the MP for Waiariki, which includes Rotorua, we need some serious answers about what's been done in this particular space. And especially predominantly Maori who are in this position. Not only that, is that if you look at state housing, we make up 50% of that as well. And so, we need to be looking at what are some of the solutions that the government has, or are they just going to continue to spend millions of dollars of taxpayers' money into emergency housing? When do we start seeing the transition into houses? And what does that look like in the future?
But Rawiri, can you just be clear with me here? So when you say no more emergency housing referrals, do you just mean in Rotorua while the inquiry is underway, or are you talking across the whole country?
Yeah, we're talking about Rotorua at this particular time as the MP for Waiariki.
Okay, so what happens to that, people? If you can't refer them to these motels, houses don't grow on trees. Where do they go? And the Prime Minister has said she would rather have whānau in these motels than in cars. And doesn't she have a point with that?
Oh, I get that. But it's been 3 years now. And so many of these families haven't seen the end of the... When is the light at the end of the tunnel? What has been done in the 3 years that these emergency hotels have been used? That's the answer. That's the question. So it's okay to say, yes, we prefer them to be in hotels rather than cars. But so even some of these hotels are, the degradation of those hotels and the conditions that many of those whānau are living in is absolutely appalling.
So where would you put those whānau in the meantime, though, Rawiri?
No, excuse me. The government have had 3 years to come up with a solution to start transitioning these people into homes. The question is to the government, in those 3 years that you've spent millions and millions of dollars on emergency housing, how many have gone into transitional housing? What is the plan to get more into transitional housing? What is happening with social housing development? And where do we start to break down the list of those who are waiting for houses? But there are families who have been in those hotels for 3 years now, and you can't continue to say, yeah, but it's better than staying in a house, in a vehicle. And so we want answers by the government. We want answers by the government to say, when do they start to transition into houses?
Okay, so when it comes to the quality of those motels, which you've raised, and obviously this investigation did too, what responsibility does the minister in charge, so the housing minister, what responsibility does she have and the government have to ensure the quality of the accommodation when taxpayers are kicking in $1 million a day for this accommodation?
That's exactly right. And who's spending it? So it's the government. It's the government and the government agencies who are spending taxpayers' money. And so we deserve to know what the hell's going on with our money, where is it being spent, how is it being spent, and if it's been spent into those hotels, that's actually made quite good profits during lockdown, where they would never have had anybody staying in those motels, and they've done relatively well. But the problem is there has been no accountability for those hotels to ensure that those people who are living in emergency housing in those hotels are dry, warm, and safe. And
do you have an issue?
They showed that it wasn't that they're not getting any of that.
Before you go, Rawiri, do you have an issue with one of the housing suppliers also owning a security company that is policing the tenants in that emergency housing? Do you have an issue with that at all?
I do have an issue with that, and that's why the inquiry needs to happen.
Why? What's wrong with it?
Well, because you can't. So you're going to get contracts for housing people, right? And then you're going to use another company that you own to then take the security for it, and just in their expose itself, the security clientele that you're employing it may be reputable. So those are some of the things that we need to be looking at. We want the inquiry to look across all of those issues to ensure that our people those people that are in emergency housing know that they're going to be safe, they're going to be warm, and they're going to be able to look after their families in a safe environment. At this particular time, the expose is showing that they're not safe, and many of the people who I've spoken to, who have been in emergency housing, who live around Fenton Street, know that there is a lot of work to be done here, but it is a very, very unsafe environment for those people at this particular time, and we want answers.
Kia ora for your time this evening. That's Rawiri Waititi, who's the co-leader of Te Pāti Māori. Now, in a statement, the Housing Minister, Megan Woods, says she heard of complaints of a potentially serious nature on the 4th of April. At that time, police told the ministry it had the mechanisms in place to take care of people using the services, and police advised no further action was needed. A month ago, a QC checked if there was anything more that should be done to review the actions that have been taken. The draft findings have determined the ministry has taken reasonable steps based on the information available at the time. The minister says the government is building public houses as quickly as it can and says that there are nearly 300 homes under construction across Rotorua. It is 5:15. Kia mau tunu mai. You're listening to Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm very keen to hear what you think about that. Text us on 2101 or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Do we need an inquiry, as Rawiri Waititi is calling for, or you're happy with the spend at the moment on that accommodation? More than half of the 501s sent from Australia to Aotearoa have committed crimes since arriving, numbering more than 14,000 offences since 2015. New police data shows the proportion of reoffenders has jumped 17% in 3 years. Some of them say it's inevitable because of the situation they find themselves in when they're deported. Our reporter Katie Todd and cameraman Samuel Rillstone sat down with some of them.
In the middle of a bustling food court in Auckland, there's an innocuous meeting taking place, a catch-up between a group of former strangers and former Australian prisoners, brought together by the country's 501 policy.
We're really wanting to create a safe space where men and women can come together and then network together to be able to get our lives back together.
Organiser Nick Robinson wants to help 501s get their lives back on track and have a fresh start. But it comes as police data reveals an increasing amount of 501s are turning back to crime. Australia's deported more than 2,700 people to our shores since January 2015, and 57% have now committed offences, up from 40% 3 years ago. 43% have been convicted. Their crimes include nearly 3,000 acts of violence and nearly 4,000 of theft, burglary and fraud. Makere Hutley was deported here in 2016.
When I came back and looked for those 501s that I knew from jail over there, they were back here in addiction, doing crime, and I didn't really relate to anybody else. They're the sort of people I related to, and so sooner or later I ended up back in jail. I done what I could. I found myself a job, but I still didn't have anything around me, no people, so I related to them and back in jail again.
People who've been behind bars in Australia for more than a year are managed like people leaving prisons here. Corrections says they're subject to supervision orders and have to report to a probation officer. They get accommodation here for up to 6 months, as well as help getting clothes, food and work. Corrections will pay $2 million in the next financial year to independent groups like the Prisoners' Aid and Reintegration Society, so they can continue supporting 501s. But Nick Robinson says the reality is dozens of 501s are left largely on their own.
When people get off the plane and they get a $200 chip to be able to find their own accommodation, or pointed out accommodation which is unsuitable, where they're not in safe places, and then they're having to fend for themselves. So we've got a system over here that's at capacity.
One 501 who arrived a month ago told RNZ about walking up Queen Street, unsure where to go or who to ask for help. He didn't even know about the Ministry of Social Development. He said the accommodation offered by Corrections was a noisy hostel room, surrounded by people drinking and doing drugs, and it had been tough finding a job without a New Zealand work history. Families of 501s say they're hurting too.
doesn't know how to look after himself, doesn't know how to care for himself. He wouldn't engage with organisations because he doesn't know how.
This mum in Australia says she's endured a year of hell after her son was deported to New Zealand without so much as a chance to hug goodbye last year. She explains he was sexually abused by a priest in his Australian secondary school, then turned to violence. His actions landed him behind bars, and now she says he's estranged from all his friends and family, grappling with mental health issues in an unfamiliar country.
And that's hard as a parent. That's very hard as a parent, because our first thing is to protect our child.
The management of 501s is under apparent scrutiny from Police Minister Chris Hipkins.
We're always looking at what more we can do in that area. We have to recognise that in some cases some of them already have established links here in New Zealand, for example, with other 501 deportees. That creates some challenges for us when they arrive in New Zealand. So we're always looking closely at that.
It's a policy Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern has called corrosive and is hoping the new Australian government won't take such a hard line on. She says the circumstances vary for each 501 coming into the country, but for every person arriving, there's one goal.
We want their integration to be as safe for them and for us as possible.
501s say ideally the deportation policy would be scrapped. All they're asking for in the meantime is a safe space to restart their lives with reliable support.
And that was Katie Todd reporting there. If you want to look at the video version of that story filmed by Samuel Rillstone, we'll put it up on our webpage. A manhunt is underway in Canada for 2 suspects in connection to a mass deadly stabbing. At least 10 people have been killed and more than 15 wounded. World Watch's Paulina Lau has more.
A mass stabbing spree which has rocked the central Canadian province of Saskatchewan. The 10 victims were found across 13 locations in the Indigenous area of James Smith Cree Nation and the nearby village of Weldon. 2 suspects are on the run and considered armed and dangerous. Regina Police Chief Evan Bray says police are throwing everything at the manhunt.
We continue to work diligently on this investigation with the RCMP. We still believe these suspects are likely in the city of Regina, and as such, we have a lot of resources that are dedicated to this. And I just came from a briefing downstairs. We have resources working around the clock and will be working through the night with our RCMP partners to try and bring this to a safe resolution.
Commander Officer and Assistant Chief Rhonda Blackmore is warning the public to be on alert.
Let me be clear. We are still looking for the 2 suspects. We are asking residents across Saskatchewan and our neighbouring provinces to be vigilant. At this stage in our investigation, we believe some of the victims have been targeted by the suspect and others have been attacked randomly. The 2 suspects are Damien Sanderson and Miles Sanderson. They are considered armed and dangerous.
It's believed the suspects are travelling in a black Nissan Rogue with a Saskatchewan number plate. Residents have been told to shelter in place as the manhunt continues. They're being urged not to move if they're secure and not to allow other people into their homes. It's one of the deadliest acts of mass violence Canada has ever seen. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau describes the attack as horrific and heartbreaking on Twitter. Jason Kerr is a local area journalist and editor at the Prince Albert Daily Herald.
The community of Weldon has about 200 people living in it. And James Smith Cree Nation, it's made up of 3 smaller communities, and combined they're about 2,000. So we're talking about very small communities. We're talking about isolated areas. Both of these communities are off the beaten path. You have to go off major highways to get to them.
A state of emergency has been declared in the James Smith Cree Nation. The attacks have stunned the people living in the rural communities.
Sunday morning is for church services typically, and a lot of the church services in this area have been turned into prayer services where they're praying for the victims, they're praying for the families of those who died. So a lot of people are used to seeing this kind of thing in large urban centers, your New Yorks, your Los Angeleses, maybe Toronto, Vancouver. To see something like this in small town Saskatchewan is very unnerving.
It's still unknown what the motive is, and police are hesitant to give any information, given the high number of crime scenes and victims. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police say they'll release a statement with an update on the case tomorrow morning.
And it's 23 minutes past 5. You're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Coming up, we talk tennis, but homai o whakaaro, we would love your feedback on anything you've heard on the program this evening. What do you make of the situation with emergency housing motels in Rotorua? Love to hear from you if you live in the area. Text us on 2101. You can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, or the email address is checkpoints@rnz.co.nz. Time to go to the headlines now. Ko Sarah anō tēnei.
Kia ora, Lisa. The MP for Waiariki, Arawiri Waititi, is calling for an independent investigation into allegations of substandard emergency housing in Rotorua. The draft findings of a report has found the Housing Ministry took reasonable steps to address the issue based on the information it had. But Mr Waititi claims that some of the country's most vulnerable people living in the motels are being put at risk. New police powers will stop gangs from hiding property that has been funded through crime. Amendments to the Criminal Proceeds Recovery Act mean assets valued at more than $30,000 can be seized from organised crime associates if it's suspected they weren't paid for legally. The government is downplaying any notion that its plan to eradicate Mycoplasma bovis has suffered a setback. Infected animals on a third farm have been discovered through routine monitoring. Less than 4 months ago, only one infected property remained. The police in the Canadian province of Saskatchewan are searching for 2 suspects after 10 people were stabbed to death. At least another 15 were wounded. And epidemiologist Michael Baker says the COVID traffic light system needs to be replaced with one that can adapt to whatever the virus does in the future. The settings are up for review next week, with the Prime Minister saying mask use will also be considered. And looking at the traffic now, in Auckland, a crash is blocking the right southbound State Highway 1 lane just after the Penrose Overbridge. Waka Kotahi says pass the scene with care and be prepared for some delays. I'll have more headlines and traffic again for you at around 20 to 6.
Ngā mihi, Sarah. Polarising Australian tennis star Nick Kyrgios continues to light up the US Open. The 23rd seed has powered past the number 1 seed in New York to book a spot in his 4th Grand Slam quarterfinal. Here with more is sports reporter Clay Wilson. OK, so love him or hate him, there's no doubt he can play. Sacrificed any tennis rackets today, has he?
Well, he did attempt it a couple of times. Yeah, I mean, he's definitely not everyone's cup of tea, and we were talking about it off air. He is polarising. He's someone that some people love and some people love to hate, but the truth is he has immense potential, and he can sometimes do things on the court that no one else can really do. And we did see most of that repertoire that he has today against Daniil Medvedev, the top seed, the defending champion. And it was close at times, but pretty clinical for Nick Kyrgios to go past him in 4 sets. And while Kyrgios is the 23rd seed, Medvedev the top seed, you can't really call it an upset because Kyrgios has now beaten him 4 of the 5 times they've played each other. And that's what Kyrgios has always had the potential to do, beat these big players. But during his 10 years on tour, he's quite often had that ability, but they've been individual wins. He hasn't been able to string together tournaments or even...
Do you reckon he winds them up, Clay?
Who winds up who?
The opposition, the players he's up against.
I think he gives them
them out.
He gives them something they're not used to seeing. A lot of these players are very controlled, quiet, laser focused, and he's so left of centre in that way. He plays with emotion. He gets involved with the crowd, with his team, with the umpire. But it does really look like he's turned a bit of a corner this year because the results are starting to string together now. He looks like he's made maybe some changes off court. Perhaps his personal life's a bit more settled. Maybe he's just growing up. But he's consistently playing. He hasn't been injured. There has been an off-court controversy, but not one that's taken him off the court. He's making some of these big events. He made the final at Wimbledon, of course. He has a career high ranking now of 18th, and he's still only 27 years old. So a lot of people you imagine he might be a bit older than that. So the potential there, if he can actually show what he's showing now, going further forward, the potential there, and maybe this US Open, who knows what's going to happen. He's in a quarter-final, but maybe this is the start of the run that he's always had that capability to pull off.
Well, it's not going to be boring, that's for sure.
No, definitely not.
OK, the other big sports story of the day is the Kiwi Scots, both of them, and the latest IndyCar race in the US.
Yes.
Got them in the right order?
I hope so. So this was the second last race of the season in Portland, and Scott McLaughlin was the winner, and a pretty dominant performance from him. And Scott Dixon started way down in 16th, climbed all the way up to 3rd. So 2 Kiwis on the podium today. Not the first time they've done that. So it puts them both in a group of 5 drivers who, going into this last race, which is going to be in California next Monday morning New Zealand time, can all win the title. Scott McLaughlin he's going to need a bit of good fortune and a good performance because he's 40 points back. So he does need to do well and hope that some things fall his way. But just his second season, so really is ahead of where even I think he probably expected he would be. So if he doesn't win next weekend, win the championship, then still a lot of room there, a lot of signs there that he can go on to do that. And Scott Dixon just doing what he does. He's won this title 6 times. Over 40 years old now, but he's just so consistent and proven by this season. He's only had 2 wins, but he's only had 1 finish in 15 or 18 races outside of the top 10, so always there or thereabouts. He's second equal on points, 20 points behind Will Power, who leads the championship, but I'm sure absolutely no one will be writing Scott Dixon off based on what he's done, 6 titles to his name, so he's going to be right in the mix there come that race next Monday morning.
You're relieved, Clay, not to be talking about the All Blacks?
It does make for a change over the last few weeks, doesn't it?
Yeah, thanks, Clay. Clay Wilson there. AUT is warning it might have to slash as many as 230 jobs as part of its post-COVID recovery plan. The university says it's seen a significant drop in international students throughout the pandemic, lockdowns and border closures. Domestic student enrolments are down and it's seeing an increasing number of school leavers going into the workforce for economic reasons. The Tertiary Education's Union's Tina Smith joins us now. Kia ora, Tina.
Kia ora, Lisa. Nice to talk to you.
Did this come as a surprise to staff?
Oh, an absolute shock. The people are shocked and horrified. We had no idea this was coming.
When did you first hear about it?
I just heard about it this morning along with all our members. Out of the blue, and the thing that's horrific, really horrific, is the numbers of staff that they're talking about. They're talking about 150 academic and about 80 general or professional staff, and that's full-time equivalent. So in real numbers and real people numbers, that could be a lot more. So that's horrible. One of the members said to me that they'd worked there for over 20 years and they'd never seen cuts of this magnitude ever.
So why is it happening now? Because most people will say, hey, you've got through the really hard yards of COVID, the borders are open, so why now?
Exactly. Look, one of the things we know is that AUT made a $12.8 million surplus last year, but again, they just budgeted on a $6.8 million surplus. So their projections haven't been great all the way along the line. We do know that student numbers are going to be down next year. Students like you and me and everybody else in New Zealand had a tough time over COVID, and we all know that employers are just calling out for staff to come and just work. So there's that option for students to go and earn some money instead of study. But what we need to do is encourage people into the long-term futures that will do the best for them and their whānau, which is gaining the real skills that they need to rebuild our economy, this country, and for businesses. You know, short-term thinking of cutting courses, cutting students is the wrong way to go about things.
Tina, which courses are for the chop?
They've highlighted a range of courses in things like design, creativity and health. Well, what do we need going forward? We need some creativity. We definitely need areas in health. And we always need creativity to rebuild things in a better way. So I can't understand some of their thinking. I do know that some of the courses have low numbers. But what you do is you work with your staff and you say, let's look at alternatives for you. We need to keep people on board. You've been in study, Lisa. What makes a difference? Not what you learn, who you learn from. Who makes that difference in supporting you?
But arguably, well, from what the AUT is saying, it's a matter of survival. Do you believe that?
No, not totally. One of the things that they've been saying is that one of the things they're using for their rationale is that the percentage of staff without operating expenses is above the benchmarking of other universities. One of the things about AUT is it's a new university, so it does have more debt and less reserves than some of the older universities across New Zealand. But AUT did some great things. It had a higher percentage of low decile students. To cut support from that seems really a silly thing to do. They've done well because they've been a good employer in the past. So why change a formula that worked really well? Yes, it's going to be a bit of a rocky time, but what you do in a rocky time is you stand together, you hold tight, and you say, we're going to take the long view, not some short-sighted cut, and then lose the absolute gold and silver that makes your institution valuable.
Appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us, Tina. That's Tina Smith, who's from the Tertiary Education Union there. A lot of you getting in touch about emergency housing and Rotorua. This listener says there have been millions spent on bureaucracy for housing, but very little on actual housing, says Grant. Another person says the Maori Party was part of the government that sold off state houses and started putting people in motels. Disingenuous, at least. And Di says the government is not doing enough on housing. It's not building enough. It's not dealing with landlords who prey on renters with substandard housing and exorbitant rents. It's penalising the most vulnerable for the failure of successive governments to provide housing. That's Labor and National. They both blame and penalise the poor they have created. Do keep your feedback coming, 2101 on text, or you can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ. It is 25 minutes to 6. Kia mo tonu mai. Stay with us. You're listening to Checkpoint on RNZ National. And it's time for the business news. Ko taku hoa I nei ko Nona Peltier. Nona Peltier joins us live in the studio now. Space, the final frontier. Nona. I think we're rolling
the final frontier for some, but for New Zealand, it's opportunity. And one of the reasons why, according to a conference that's going on in Christchurch today, it's the Aerospace Summit, is because we have a launching pad. We can launch ourselves into success.
See what you did
There's loads of opportunity, not just for the folks in that sector, but for women too. Time to get up there and...
Doing what?
Well,
firing other people's goodies into space or something more?
Why not? Why not? I mean, it's aerospace, and it's the new frontier, as you just said. Why not get into that? Tech jobs, they're there.
Okay, interesting. Let us talk about building activity, right? Continuing to rise, volume of it.
Wow, yes, indeed. Okay, so it's a bit of not a surprise that we're still seeing volume of activity. 2.6% rise in the 3 months ended June over the March quarter. Now, interestingly, values are way up. So overall, 12% increase in values over the year earlier. But look, some of these numbers are huge, like a 17% increase in residential housing construction, a 36%...
You mean the cost of?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
A 36% rise in factories and industrial buildings, and, other increases across the board.
So if you're building an industrial building, you're paying 36% more for that construction.
Than you would have in last year. So the sector is looking like maybe it's getting a bit toppy there, and it could be running out of steam. There is population, not so much population growth, and so on. So whether or not this continues, it's hard to say. But yeah, right now it's pretty pricey.
Okay, let's take a womble around the markets.
Okay, there's not a lot to say about the markets today, and that's partly because there's a U.S. holiday, it's Labor Day, and there's an election going on in Britain. And so that's seen some strange numbers come through. So our index, top 50 index, very little change, just a 9-point fall to 11,619. The dollar, it's trading at 60.9 U.S. cents, but that's because we're seeing the U.S. dollar at 20-year highs, 89.7 Australian, and the British pound, it's taken a bit of a dive ahead of that election result. So we're trading at 53.1 British pence. So if you're going there, this is the time to get your currencies.
Thank you, Nona. Nona Peltier there with Business News. An epidemiologist says the COVID traffic light system needs to be replaced by a system that's fit for purpose. The settings will be up for review next week, with the Prime Minister saying mask use will also be examined. Crystal Gibbons reports.
Masks could be on the way out, with the government hinting changes are coming to the way the country lives with COVID. But Professor Michael Baker says there needs to be a system that adapts for what the virus may do in the future. He says this could be a move to a COVID-safe culture, such as people isolating when they've got a respiratory illness, good indoor air ventilation, mask wearing in certain places, and vaccinations.
I think if we have all these tools that are organised around a really clear articulation of a level of risk, I think that will give us our best chances of minimising the harm from this pandemic.
It's a sentiment Dr. Susie Wiles agrees with. She says we need to be thinking about how to protect people.
So we shouldn't be thinking about restrictions. We should be thinking about what public health measures will we need to put in place now and for the future.
She says New Zealand is between waves and this time should be used for looking at how ventilation and air purification can be improved.
How can we make the air safer indoors? Because that is what will help keep this disease, minimise transmission, protect us.
Dr. Baker says he himself finds mask wearing challenging in social situations, but there are significant health risks that come with the virus and there needs to be good guidelines around reducing mask wearing. But he says there may be opportunities to reduce mask requirements in well-ventilated indoor environments.
And I'm sure many shopping malls, supermarkets, and a lot of retail environments would meet those criteria. And I think people who are managing those venues can think about ventilation. And it may be that if you meet certain ventilation standards, you no longer have to require mask use in those places.
Executive Director of the New Zealand Taxi Federation, Warren Quirk, says while their drivers wear masks, they're already seeing passengers start to leave them behind.
It's like anywhere around the country. They tend to be wearing them or not wearing them. It seems to be becoming more common for people not to be wearing them.
Vaughan Quio is the president of the Secondary Principals Association and says they're also starting to see students use discretion on what environment they wear a mask in. He says it's time to look at the requirements for household contacts.
I would like to see personally that if you're not sick, you're not required to isolate and that you can return to work with a test if you return a negative test.
Any changes to the current COVID settings will be announced after Cabinet meets next Monday.
Time for some more of your feedback now. A lot of you getting in touch about Rotorua and the emergency housing situation there. Te Pāti Maori wants an inquiry after allegations about the conditions there and how the tenants are being treated. This listener says those motels are dumps and asking huge weekly rent. When this is all over, they'll have enough money to demolish and rebuild. They have won lotto every week. Bob from Glendine says an inquiry into emergency housing is needed to review costs, conditions and lack of oversight. And Sue from Wellington raises a good point. She says landlords have to jump through hoops in order to ensure they are providing warm, dry accommodation to tenants. Aren't the moteliers involved in emergency accommodation technically landlords? What are the regulations regarding these tenancies? Do keep your feedback coming, 2101 on text or tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ. It is 19 minutes to 6 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. And coming up, the seabirds tuck it out by battling the blustery winter conditions. And Homai Ofakaro, send us your feedback on anything you've heard on the programme. 2101 on text, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ or the email address checkpoints@rnz.co.nz. Let's go to the headlines now. Anea Sera, mena pita pita kōrero.
Thanks, Lisa. The union representing university staff is shocked that as many as 230 jobs could be axed at the Auckland University of Technology. The university says it's suffered a significant drop in international students throughout the pandemic, lockdowns and border closures. The MP for Waiariki says no more people should be put in emergency housing in Rotorua motels amid claims of substandard conditions. Rawiri Waititi is calling for an independent inquiry into the situation. He says the conditions some of the people are living in are absolutely appalling. Residents of the Canadian province of Saskatchewan are being told to remain vigilant as police hunt for two suspects in one of the country's deadliest acts of mass violence. 10 people have been stabbed to death and at least another 15 have been wounded. Consumer New Zealand wants more drastic action to regulate the retirement village sector. The Retirement Village Association has announced it will trial voluntary reforms amongst its members, including a review of unfair contract clauses. Consumer NZ CEO John Duffy says that's not enough. And the COVID traffic light settings are being reviewed next week, with an epidemiologist saying it needs to be replaced with a system fit for purpose. Michael Baker says a new system needs to adapt to whatever the virus does in the future. The Prime Minister says mask wearing will also be considered as part of the review. And updating the traffic, the crash that happened just south of the Penrose Overbridge on State Highway 1 in Auckland, southbound, has been cleared from the lanes, but there are still delays, so be careful when you are passing there.
Thanks, Sarah. A court has heard there was an ingrained culture of bullying and mocking at Gloria Vale, where powerful and controlling leaders punished women. Former member Virginia Courage told the employment court she was mocked for the way she looked when she was pregnant, as Jean Edwards reports.
Virginia Courage says Gloria Vale's founder, Hopeful Christian, was a bully.
Bullying and mocking people in Gloria Vale is such a part of the culture, and you're desensitised to it. Hopeful mocked me about how I looked when I was pregnant. He mocked how I walked when I was fully pregnant.
She told the court the Christian community's leaders wielded power over women by ordering them to work in places like the baby and sewing rooms as punishment. Mrs. Courage says Gloria Vale's overseeing shepherd put her niece on gruelling daily duties for 6 months.
And she said to me, "I think Howard's trying to kill me," because she was having to work so hard. She wasn't allowed to work with anyone else. Every task she did, she had to do by herself. That is because he had the control and the power.
She says one of the women in the kitchen would often growl at mothers who were feeding their babies.
She would say things to them like, "Don't you take too long with feeding that baby. You just do what you need to do and then you get back to that kitchen, it needs you."
When her younger sister died in an isolation room, Virginia Courage says one of the leaders was still carrying the pin to the door 4 hours later.
And I had to go and ask him, could he please put the pin back in the door, because we were there with the rescue teams, with the ambulance, with the police, and everyone kept getting locked in the room. I would call that complete control and power.
Mrs. Courage says she was reared with a real sense of obligation.
You're told right from little that if Hopeful hadn't set up the community and your parents hadn't joined, and if Hopeful hadn't preached the faith to them, that you wouldn't have been born. So right from little, you've got this strong sense that you're obligated to the community. You owe them something.
Her 9-week-old son Jonas is the only one of her 11 children to have been born on the outside. She says he's the easiest baby she's ever had.
When you're in Gloria Vale, you have to routine your baby to fit in with the community's routine. I spend so much more time with them. My older kids have said to me, "Mummy, he's going to be spoilt." And I just said to them, love and care doesn't spoil anyone.
Virginia Courage and 5 other women want the employment court to rule they were Gloria Vale employees, not volunteers, a claim the leaders strongly deny.
Jean Edwards with that report. The retirement village sector is signalling it will change the way it operates after coming under pressure from residents and consumer groups. A raft of voluntary reforms are being put to Retirement Village Association members, which account for 95% of the country's retirement villages. It includes a review of unfair contract clauses. But consumers say self-regulation isn't enough. Lauren Crimp has the story.
Fred Rood's mum lived in an independent retirement village in Kirikiri. She passed away in October last year, and her contract stated fortnightly payments would continue for up to 6 months until they found another person to live in her unit. 6 months to the day his mother died, a new resident moved in.
We just found that surprising because it's at a time of housing shortages, waiting lists in retirement villages, growing numbers of the elderly, all that sort of stuff, that took them 6 months. I remember at the time I just thought that's just so cynical, like they didn't even make it a day early.
In introducing voluntary reforms, the Retirement Village Association has acknowledged that policies like these need to change. But Monique Cornish worries that even if they do, those unaware of their rights could still be taken for a ride. Ms Cornish and her 82-year-old mum were left in the lurch after her mum had a series of falls and a short stay in hospital. Her mum was receiving hospital-level care at the village, and those needs remained after her falls. But when it was time to return, they were told she couldn't come back.
This is a facility where we had a property agreement, a right to occupy, and they denied us that right because they felt like they couldn't take care of her. So she was effectively homeless for several weeks in the hospital with nowhere to go until I could find her an alternative.
It's standard practice for villages to charge an exit fee when a resident dies or leaves a village. But Ms Cornish's mum was refused re-entry, and the village tried to charge her a 30% exit fee anyway. It was only after the threat of legal action that the village backed down, and Ms Cornish says she worries for people who can't lawyer up.
Yep. Yeah,
both Ms Cornish and Mr Rood are calling for government intervention, saying that the sector can't be trusted to improve. Consumer NZ CEO John Duffy agrees. He believes the sector is front-footing changes to keep the government at bay.
A review of the sector is long overdue, and the government needs to hold firm to recommendations that come out of that review and regulate where appropriate.
Retirement Villages Association President Graham Wilkinson says 70% of villages already follow practices like not charging fees following someone vacating a unit.
Well, the intention is to make it standard. What we're doing is we're trialling over the next year. We've adopted a number of remits as best practice, and we have expectations that people will trial these. We'll research and consult with people, survey them, and next year we'll see if there's been any unintended consequences or any damage that potentially could be caused.
Those unintended consequences include worries that smaller villages will fall over if they struggle to find residents to move into vacant rooms. After the year-long trial, the measures will be formally voted on at the Retirement Villages Association's general meeting next year.
Let us know your thoughts on that one, 2101 on text. Do you think there are unfair contract clauses that need to be dealt with? And you can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ. It is 10 minutes to 6. Kia mau tonu mai. You're listening to Checkpoint on RNZ National. Some of our largest seabirds are sick and tired of this winter's foul, stormy conditions, literally. Massey University's Wild Base Hospital has treated more than half a dozen of the birds, including an albatross and petrel, after they were found exhausted and beached across the Manawatu-Whanganui region. Usually they get one or two that need patching up. Well, joining us now is Massey's senior vet, Dr Megan Jolly. Kia ora, Megan. Are you there, Megan? Can you hear me? Oh, I think we might have lost Megan. Let's see if we can raise her, wanting to talk about these birds that keep washing up in the stormy conditions. No. All right, we'll come back to her. Let's move on. Fans of the Fast and Furious franchise are infuriating neighbours in one of Los Angeles' communities where street races are burning rubber at all hours of the night. While street racing has been around much longer than the films, residents can't help but feel the films are contributing to the problems. CNN's Stephanie Elam has more.
From around the globe,
in the Fast and Furious world, Bob's Market is an icon.
Fast and Furious fans come to this Los Angeles neighborhood to take pictures in front of this shop made famous by the movie franchise.
We are here in LA, so I want to see the market and also the house from Fast and Furious.
It's nice. I mean, this is really great.
But the movies, known for their fast cars and daring stunts, have left their mark on this neighborhood in another way. The scars of street racing and donuts mark the intersection where so-called takeovers, similar to these, have invaded the neighborhood.
They're coming around drifting, doing donuts, spinning around like crazy with their mufflers sounding like explosions.
For the people who live here,
the smoke that it leaves behind from the tires burning, it lingers. It doesn't go away.
It's more than a nuisance.
You hear these like screeches, and it happens until the cops come.
It's dangerous and illegal. Takeovers like these happening at all hours of the day.
You're putting our lives at risk. You're putting our neighborhood at risk. They don't stop at the stop signs anymore.
Across the country, drivers are taking over streets, racing, doing donuts, and burnouts. Just in the last week, an entire block was damaged by out-of-control cars in Des Moines. Police in Salt Lake City arrested 6 people for illegally racing. Another blocked police from getting to a shooting in Portland, Oregon. Chandler, Arizona police say an illegal drag race left 1 driver dead. Near Chicago, a pedestrian was struck and killed. A city alderman saying higher fines and impounding vehicles has little effect.
And we see these incidents not stopping. They haven't stopped. If anything, they're getting worse and worse.
rumble strips in Compton, California, did little to slow down the takeovers. Fed up residents in LA taking to the streets in protest.
That's Larry and that's Larry.
Anna Marie Piersimoni is one of them. She lost Larry Brooks, her husband of more than 30 years, when he went out for some exercise and never came home.
The driver revved his car to 90, spun out, lost control. He hit my husband and 6 other cars. My husband had 10 minutes to live after that. It's called vehicular manslaughter, but it was murder.
She and others are calling for a disclaimer to be added to the Fast and Furious films, convinced they've glamorized street racing. Universal Pictures did not return a request for comment.
I feel furious. Yes, there's another meaning to that word in the movie, Fast and Furious.
You can go to jail, you can kill someone, you can injure yourself.
Lily Trujillo Puckett started the nonprofit Street Racing Kills after her 16-year-old daughter Valentina was killed in 2013. Now Puckett mentors street racers who've been punished by the courts.
When your whole dreams and your life is going away for 40 years, and you're going to have the other party telling you this is what you took away from us.
Her message not heard nearly enough, she says. Lost in a haze of burning rubber and roaring engines.
Well, back home now, and let's return to the story about our large seabirds. Some of them have taken a real hammering during the stormy winter months, and more than usual have been washing up on the Manawatu-Whanganui beaches, and Massey University's Wild-Based Hospital is the ones looking after them. Their senior vet, Dr Megan Jolly, joins us now. Kia ora, Doctor.
Kia ora, Susie.
Hey, can you tell us what sort of injuries are you seeing? What's happening to these birds?
Usually with the seabirds, they're actually what we call storm blown, which is a sort of catch-all term for when they're a bit weak and a bit exhausted from being blown around at sea, and they end up washed ashore. And in the case of these really big guys, it's actually really hard for them to get airborne again from when they land in the middle of the North Island. So we end up with them storm blown. We have had one recently who actually had an injury, our Salvins that we just had recently. She had a unknown predator wound to her neck. So that was a bit of a careful procedure to stitch up without affecting her beautiful feathers and their very careful waterproofing.
So basically they get knackered, they're exhausted from battling the headwinds, and then they sort of, pull up stumps for a rest somewhere and then can't get moving again.
Yeah, pretty much. One theory is that they usually go over the North Island, and if they're flying a little bit lower than they usually do and they come across a mountain, they just go down and then they can't get back up again. We do certainly see pre-existing problems amongst them, like heavy worm burdens or large bellies full of plastic and other foreign bodies, that kind of thing, which obviously affects their overall health. And then when they're a bit weakened by that, the storm is just too much for them.
That's a bit sad about the plastic. Are any of them showing up in weird places? Have they touched down in strange places?
Yeah, so we have had some weird ones. Well, it's weird enough that they're here at the Manawatu. We don't see a lot of seabirds because here at Massey we're right in the middle of the North Island. So we tend to see ones washed up on some of our beaches. But we had a white-capped albatross late last year who landed in the middle of a paddock full of dairy cows, and the farmer knew something was up because he could see the cows looking at something. I think he was a bit surprised to find an albatross in the middle of his field.
So what do you do if you do find an albatross or a petrel in the middle of your backyard or field?
Yeah, so for the big guys, it can be quite difficult to handle them. They can be quite dangerous with that beak, depending on how strong they still are. So the best option would be to call Department of Conservation for advice. There's a hotline number on the website, and your local doc will be able to help you out with how to go about. Either someone will come out or how to go about catching it and bringing it to us.
Hey, and just before you go, let's have a bit of good news. Is it easy enough to patch them up and roll them back out again?
I wouldn't say easy. There's definitely some careful steps involved, and keeping care of those beautiful feathers is our main and refeeding them are our main tasks. But once we can do that and we turn them around as quickly as possible and we get them back out to sea, usually released with the help of the Coast Guard on either side of the island, depending on the weather. We take them out to the better side.
They take them out and release them further out?
Yeah, we take them out to whichever side of the North Island is behaving better weather-wise. Either Napier or Foxton Coast Guard take us out and we release them off the boat. It's the best way.
Lovely to talk to you. Thank you for joining us. That is Dr. Megan Jolly, who's Massey's senior vet there, working with these big seabirds that have been really struggling in some cases against some pretty bad weather. We're all feeling that, although it's spring now. Let's talk about Rotorua and emergency housing there. Josh has got in touch and says, I recently had a weekend holiday in Rotorua, which has always been an absolute favourite getaway destination and also a place that I whakapapa to. I walked the length of Fenton Street, not knowing what had been happening in the city. There is no denying that there was once a golden mile of motels and hotels, and it's now a mixed bag with most of the motels in a state of disrepair. What worries me is how the owners of these establishments are so happy to let them go to absolute ruin. Sounds like they're being paid well by the government, and yet there appears to be zero maintenance going on. I was thinking, wouldn't it be amazing if each motel had a live-in camp mother or father providing wraparound support and maintenance? I fear the ways we help our most vulnerable often don't allow for enough personal one-on-one support. So many New Zealanders have no compassion as they've never had to live in poverty, says Josh. And another person says, I think an inquiry is a good call. These people are in limbo, living in motels for 3 years at a time. At the end of the day, it's all of our money, and it's important that the government be transparent.
RNZ News at 6 o'clock. Good evening, I'm Sarah Bradley. The Maori Party is calling for an independent investigation into Rotorua's emergency housing following serious concerns about the quality of the motel accommodation. TVNZ's Sunday program has revealed tenants are living in dangerous and substandard conditions. Te Pāti Māori co-leader Rawiri Waititi has told Checkpoint they are owed answers.
The government have had 3 years to come up with a solution to start transitioning these people into homes. The question is to the government, in those 3 years that you've spent millions and millions of dollars on emergency housing, how many have gone into transitional housing? What is the plan to get more into transitional housing? What is happening with social housing development?
Rawiri Waititi says people are living in fear and see no light at the end of the tunnel. Police are being given more powers to seize assets from gangs. The government has announced an amendment to the Criminal Proceeds Recovery Act, which will allow police to restrain property belonging to associates of organised criminal groups if there's a suspicion they didn't fund it legitimately. Overseas criminals who have assets in New Zealand will also have 2 months to prove they obtained property legally or face losing it. The amendment will also make KiwiSaver subject to forfeit orders. Consumers are calling on the government to regulate the retirement village sector. The Retirement Village Association has announced it will trial voluntary reforms amongst its members, including a review of unfair contract clauses. Consumer NZ CEO John Duffy says more drastic action is needed.
I don't think they go far enough to ward off regulation, so I think a review of the sector is long overdue, and the government needs to hold firm to recommendations that come out of that review and regulate where appropriate.
John Duffy says retirement village residents currently have fewer rights than tenants renting from a landlord. An epidemiologist says the COVID traffic light system needs to be replaced by one that's more fit for purpose. The settings will be up for review next week, with the Prime Minister saying mask use will also be considered. Professor Michael Baker says a system is needed that adapts to what the virus could do in the future. He says a COVID-safe culture should be in place, involving people with respiratory illness isolating, safe indoor ventilation and wearing masks in key environments. The government is considering the current settings next Monday. The police in the Canadian province of Saskatchewan are searching for 2 suspects after 10 people were stabbed to death. At least another 15 were wounded. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police are investigating 13 possible crime scenes, including an Indigenous reserve. Jason Kerr, the editor at the Prince Albert Daily Herald, says such incidents are very unusual.
James Smith Cree Nation, which is where the first stabbing took place, there are only about 2,000 people living there. Weldon, which is nearby, which is where other stabbings took place, there are only about 200 people living there. To see something like this happen in small rural areas is very surprising for a lot of people and very shocking.
The suspects have been named as Damien and Miles Sanderson. A statement by Indigenous leaders indicates the attacks may be drug-related. A man deported from Australia claims 501 deportees are finding it nearly impossible to escape the cycle of crime. Police data shows 2,758 deportees have arrived on our shores since 2015, and in that time, 57% of them have reoffended. When Makere Hutley arrived in 2016, he says he found a job and tried to start anew, but ended up back in jail because the only people he knew were fellow criminals from Australia. Despite reintegration support, Mr Hutley says the 501 deportees are turning to crime because they're having to fend for themselves.
I just feel like I don't fit in here, there, or anywhere. I just feel like Nick said, feel a bit lost, feel like an outsider.
The Crown is delivering its closing statements in a 7-week trial over alleged concealed political donations. 7 people, including former MP Jamie Lee Ross, are defending charges of obtaining by deception laid by the Serious Fraud Office. The Crown alleges 3 separate donations to the National and Labour parties were split into smaller amounts to avoid triggering the disclosure limit and to protect the identity of the donor. Crown lawyer Paul Wicks says the evidence shows that businessman Jung E. Quinn was the true donor who was hiding his identity.
He was actively involved in initiating all of the transfers and consulted with or kept informed by Shona Zhang and Colin Jing thereafter. And the Crown's evidence also establishes he knew that sham donors were being used.
A private jet with 4 people on board has crashed into the Baltic Sea after flying erratically across Western Europe. The BBC's Sophie Glass-Ryan reports.
The Cessna plane took off from Jerez in southern Spain, heading for Cologne in Germany. According to German media, it was carrying a pilot and a family of 3. The Bild newspaper said the plane reported cabin pressure problems after taking off and then lost contact as it left the Iberian Peninsula. The aircraft turned twice at Paris and Cologne, then flew on past the Swedish island of Gotland. The pilots of German and Danish warplanes sent to check on it reported they were unable to see anyone in the cockpit or cabin. The private plane was later spotted spinning and crashing into the sea near the Latvian coast.
Queenstown Airport is holding an emergency training exercise tonight. The airport says it's a full-scale exercise involving fire and emergency, the police and St John. It started at 5 and ends at 9 tonight. An airport spokesperson says the public should not worry if they hear sirens or see flashing lights or emergency vehicles. Flights are not affected. And that's the news.
Tonight on Nights, Helene Elliott looks back on the US Tennis Open. The last, perhaps, for women's great, Serena Williams. Sharam Arian introduces us to the music of Aki Banai. She was an Iranian pop star until her career was cut short by the Islamic Revolution. And neuroscientist Christine Azolans on how men and women experience pain differently on Nights with me, Brian Crump, after the news at 7 on RNZ National.
We're back with Lisa Owen and Checkpoint in just a moment, but first the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Warnings and watches for heavy rain, strong winds and snow are in place for parts of both the North and the South Island. Northland to Whanganui, including Coromandel Peninsula and the Bay of Plenty. Rain heavy at times with possible thunderstorms north of Auckland, becoming fine early tomorrow. Gisborne, Hawke's Bay and the Central High Country. Rain becoming heavy with snow lowering to 400 metres, easing to showers tomorrow morning and clearing tomorrow afternoon. Manawatu to Wellington and Wairarapa. Rain with snow possible to 500 metres, easing overnight, then clearing tomorrow morning. Marlborough and Canterbury, showers with snow to low levels, becoming fine north of Seddon this evening and elsewhere tomorrow morning. For Nelson, Buller and Westland, fine apart from isolated showers. Otago, Southland and Fiordland, showers, snow to low levels until tomorrow morning. And for the Chatham Islands, showers. You're listening to RNZ National. It's coming up to 8 minutes past 6. More will have the headlines at 6:30.
Nā mihi. No mai hoki mai. This is Checkpoint ko Lisa Owen tēnei. The Health Minister will get official advice on a bunch of new recommendations for reducing methamphetamine harm before deciding whether to adopt any of them. A report released by the Helen Clark and Drug Foundations advocates for a health-based approach that includes fully decriminalising possession of small quantities of any drug, including meth, a pilot where addicts are given a substitute stimulant or methamphetamine in tightly controlled circumstances if 2 attempts at rehab haven't worked, and providing incentives for clear drug tests. The report concludes its approach may surprise some, but the alternative has failed to address meth harm. I asked Health Minister Andrew Little if the government's prepared to decriminalise methamphetamine.
I am satisfied that the stuff we've done to date actually is a big step towards that. I think if we also reflect on, New Zealanders' appetite for significant decriminalisation we saw with the cannabis referendum in 2020, that actually, we are not there yet in terms of whether people accept that as an effective measure. But we do need to have, do more than just giving people a criminal record who actually have a health problem, an addiction problem. And so that's why we've, in the last 5 years, put a lot more resources into those health responses, a lot more money going into help with addictions and peer-led support for those with addictions, and a variety of programs around the country that we're now supporting.
One of the key recommendations in this report is a substitute drug program, or allowing people to take meth and providing them with the meth to take in controlled circumstances. Will you give that consideration?
Look, we'll give consideration to anything that I think provides an effective health response. We've done that with, the needle exchange program. We did it with opiate substitution programs too for those, with methadone and what have you.
So what's the problem with doing it for meth then? If you see the logic in doing it in those circumstances, why not apply it to meth?
As I said, we would consider anything that is an effective health response. I haven't had any specific advice on that. We have focused on the effective responses for addiction problems, and including, alcohol and other drug courts, supporting the programs that enable people who do enter the criminal justice system to get the health help that they need to avert, other criminal responses.
There are a few other things, and I want to go through them quickly just to see where you sit on them. One of the other things is rewarding people for negative urine tests, right? And that can be a financial reward or something else. Would you look at that?
Haven't considered that to date. I think the important thing is to make sure that we have programs to get people to address their addictions. That's the most important thing. And actually, when I talk to those who've recovered from addictions, is the reward is the return of their life, frankly, to them for that. So, look,
But some people need more than that. As you know, addiction it's a terrible grip on people. And if there is a suggestion that this could work, why not give it a crack?
I think the other thing we know about addiction is that often people have to attempt more than once to seek recovery. They often take multiple attempts to address their addiction. And so there may well be a sense of, okay, we'll pay you for this. That it's just a negative test is not itself an indication that you've fully addressed your addiction problem or you're on the path to recovery. It's a range of other things we need to be addressing.
And I suppose the report does address that, because they say that we need to move away from perhaps old-fashioned thinking where abstinence is the end goal, that it is an unrealistic goal for everyone, and that policies should change to reflect that. For example, allowing people into programs and not needing them to go cold turkey in order to enter a program. So how could you change what we're doing to fit the change in approach to addiction?
Yeah, and we have done that. We've supported the Kahukura program. We've been lambasted by the opposition because it's a program addressing gang meth addiction, because gang members often struggle to fit into other programs. It's a program where most people who enter it test positive when they enter it, but of the 39 people who've been through that program, 38 have come out the other side with negative tests throughout the program and keeping their life together following it. It's a program that doesn't just help the addicted person, it helps the family of the addicted person, because the reality is people recovering from addiction, it's not just their journey, it's the journey of those around them. So we are open to those sorts of things, as we've proven with the Kahukura program.
Because the thing is, you know the expression, you keep doing the same thing and expecting a different outcome. It is the definition of you know what, right? So some of the things outlined in this program require some bravery and to ignore perhaps moral panic, as the report has described it, over meth addiction. Are you prepared to take some risks and do some of the things in this report?
Well, I think if you look at our track record, we have done that. We did it with the Kahukura program. We've done it with Extending Hara Oranga. We've done it with the Alcohol and Other Drug Court expansion.
But it's about doing more, isn't it, Minister? Because that's what it requires, not just what you're doing now, more.
Yeah. And I think part of it is, part of the inherent kind of New Zealand concern about the steps we take is it's wanting to have confidence that the measures we take are going to work. And I think we are developing a track record now, have done with the measures we've supported in the last 5 years, of a track record of interventions and programs that actually work. I think the more the public sees that and gets confidence in it, then it paves the way for us to roll them out further and expand them.
And that was Health Minister Andrew Little. It's one of Canada's deadliest acts of mass violence. 10 people stabbed and killed and at least another 15 wounded. A major manhunt is now underway and 2 suspects are still on the run. The victims were found across 13 locations in the Indigenous area of James Smith Cree Nation and the village of Weldon. Commanding Officer for the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, Rhonda Blackmore, gave this update on the victims.
At this point in our investigation, we have located 10 deceased individuals in 13 locations in the community of James Smith Cree Nation and Weldon, Saskatchewan. Several additional victims have been injured, 15 of which at this point have been transported to various hospitals. There may be additional injured victims who transported themselves to various hospitals.
The suspects are travelling in a black Nissan Rogue.
Let me be clear. We are still looking for the 2 suspects. We are asking residents across Saskatchewan and our neighbouring provinces to be vigilant. At this stage in our investigation, we believe some of the victims have been targeted by the suspect and others have been attacked randomly. The 2 suspects are Damien Sanderson and Miles Sanderson. Damien Sanderson is described as a 31-year-old male, 5'7", 155 pounds, with black hair and brown eyes. Miles Sanderson is a 30-year-old male, 6'1", 240 pounds, with brown hair and brown eyes. If Damien and Miles are listening or receive this information, I would ask that they turn themselves into police immediately. They are considered armed and dangerous.
A motive is still unknown and the police say the investigation and search will continue overnight. It is 16 minutes past 6 and you're with Checkpoints on RNZ National. In a few hours, the UK Conservative Party will announce its new leader and they will become the next Prime Minister, replacing Boris Johnson. Whoever wins will face a number of challenges, including soaring energy prices. Frontrunner Liz Truss says she'll set out immediate action on energy bills if she's elected. Meanwhile, Rishi Sunak says he's got a clear plan to help people struggling with bills, including support to insulate their homes. The BBC's Chris Mason has more.
Behind millions of doors right now, anxiety about spiralling bills. And behind this door by Tuesday afternoon, a new Prime Minister. Hello. Liz Truss is all but certain to replace Boris Johnson.
I understand that people are struggling with eye-watering energy bills, and there are predictions of even worse down the track.
And so the only question that matters, what will she do?
If I'm elected as Prime Minister, I will act immediately on bills and on energy supply, because I think those 2 things go hand in hand. We need to deal with the immediate problem. We need to help people. We need to help businesses. But we also need to sort out the supply issues that have made us end up being where we are now.
Liz Truss also explained today the rationale at the heart of her approach to tax and the economy. In short, her desire to cut taxes. Cutting national insurance, as she has promised, benefits better paid people more than poorer paid ones.
Inevitably, when you cut taxes, you tend to benefit people who are more likely to pay tax. Of course, there are some people who don't pay tax at all. But to look at everything through the lens of redistribution, I believe is wrong. Because what I'm about is about growing the economy. And growing the economy benefits everybody. So far, the economic debate for the past 20 years has been dominated by discussions about distribution. And what's happened is we have had relatively low growth.
The immediate focus, though, is energy bills. Labour say they would freeze them over the winter and point out
the two leadership candidates, Liz Truss, you've just heard from, cannot give a specific answer to the one question, frankly, that everybody wants an answer to, which is what the hell is going to happen to my bills?
Still smiling while walking towards defeat, this was Rishi Sunak this morning.
It's all over now, isn't it?
Last week he sounded conciliatory towards his rival. Take a listen to his tone of concession today.
If you don't win this time, would you ever run again?
Oh gosh, we've just finished this campaign, Laura, so I need to recover from this one. But I look forward to supporting a Conservative government in whatever capacity.
So that's a yes, you're not ruling it out?
No, gosh, no. I think that my job now is to just support a Conservative government.
How much others will be willing to support the government may depend on the extent to which they feel the new Prime Minister gets the reality of life for many. People in Leeds told us what they're hoping for.
Costs need to come down and the government need to sort of take action and help support people.
I want them to think about working class people because we work hard and we can't afford lots of things.
Everything's going up, so everyone's feeling the pinch. It's a struggle when you've got children because you feel like you can't do the fun things you used to be able to do.
Yeah, it's a difficult one. I wouldn't want to be a politician trying to figure all this out because where's the money come from? I guess they're going to have to pull it from somewhere else, aren't they?
And yes, this is some distance from an easy time to take office. The dilemmas and difficulties of government will begin the moment the new Prime Minister walks through that door.
And to Australia now, higher petrol prices and bigger mortgage payments are on the way. The Australian Reserve Bank is expected to lift interest rates tomorrow. Meanwhile, the federal government is promising to address the soaring cost of living pressures in next month's budget. There is some relief coming for 5 million Australians, with welfare set to receive their biggest boost in decades. The ABC's Annie Guest reports.
If you're a single-aged pensioner, you're set to get an extra $2 a day from this month, a rise driven by increases in the Consumer Price Index. Here's Treasurer Jim Chalmers.
Well, it's really important that our payments keep up with inflation. That's why they're indexed twice a year. And every little bit helps. You know, this indexation will be particularly big this month because inflation is particularly challenging.
The age, disability support pension and carer payment are rising by $38.90 a fortnight for singles and $58.80 a fortnight for couples. Job seeker recipients aged over 22 without children will get an extra $25.70 a fortnight, taking job seeker to $677 a fortnight, including an energy supplement.
And we know that it won't solve every problem for everybody, but it's important that we try and make sure that those payments keep up. That's what the indexation is about. It will be welcome, even as we acknowledge that times will still be tough for a lot of people.
The federal government says these are the largest indexation increase to payments in more than 30 years for allowances and 12 years for pensions. Edwina McDonald is the acting CEO of ACOS.
It's really just a drop in the ocean at this point. And as the non-discretionary inflation is higher than the CPI, they're still going backwards in terms of what they can afford to buy at the moment.
It's a long way short of the 35% plus increase in social security payments that ACOS has been calling for.
Currently, job seekers at $46 a day, youth allowance is at $38 a day. And what we need to, in order to bring it up to the poverty line, is to bring it up to at least $70 a day.
However, there's no indication the government's about to do that. And Treasurer Jim Chalmers is still refusing to extend the temporary cut to the fuel excise, which ends later this month.
I've said to you many times over the last 6 months or so that it would be too expensive to continue that petrol price relief indefinitely. I think Australians understand that we've inherited a budget which is heaving with $1 trillion in Liberal Party debt, and that means some difficult decisions, including this one.
But he has written to the competition watchdog, the ACCC, asking it to make sure that petrol retailers don't take advantage of the expiry of the fuel excise reduction to penalise consumers.
Dozens of Qantas staff, from pilots to flight attendants, are raising concerns about what recent chaos inside the airline could mean for safety. Australia's national carrier has an enviable safety record globally, but staff worry that decades of outsourcing jobs and cost-cutting may be putting that at risk. The ABC's Stephen Long reports.
In recent months, Qantas customers have been forced to endure extraordinary rates of flight delays, cancellations and missing bags. Dozens of Qantas insiders have now spoken to Four Corners. To protect their identity, we haven't named them and we've used actors to voice their words. Unlike this pilot, they say there's much more going on behind the scenes.
We're working longer hours, we're redlining, running at max capacity in a very dynamic, challenging environment. There's a lot that can go wrong.
One of the things that's vital is making sure luggage and cargo are loaded correctly for the right weight distribution. An employee has told us how, in recent times, Qantas has come perilously close to error.
So what should have gone in the front went in the back. What went in the back should have gone in the front. There's a certain way aircraft have to be loaded down below, and it was only realised it was done the wrong way just before the cargo hold was supposed to be closed.
One person who can speak openly about the disruptions is pilot Tony Lucas. He's been flying for Qantas for 27 years and also heads the Pilots Association.
We're seeing them occur across multiple weeks, and ultimately that's where things start to increase in operational complexity. That any one of those things on their own isn't a big deal to deal with, but when you start adding them up all together across multiple flights, that starts to become a concern.
During the pandemic, about a third of Qantas engineers were made redundant. Qantas says it needs fewer engineers than pre-COVID because maintenance requirements are lower, with fewer international flights and older planes retired. But an engineer we interviewed says the cuts have caused great strain.
The planned work for the night, we used to get through it almost every night. Now, the first thing we do is have a look at what work is up to its time limit and has to be done so the plane can fly the next day.
And there's other pressure. Long-haul pilots were told that unless they met the investment case for new planes, Qantas had no choice but to give the work to a new company employing pilots that can provide the cost base we need. It used the same tactic with short-haul pilots.
The stress affiliated with this is underestimated. When you mix a safety-critical role with the threat of losing your job, then it really only ends one way. A mistake will be made, there will be an incident, and there could be devastating consequences as a result. And I believe that Qantas management are underestimating the impact.
When asked about the concerns, Qantas responded that unions were making baseless safety claims to further their industrial agendas. But that doesn't address the worries felt by its own employees.
To the UK now, it was a night of high emotion in London at Wembley Stadium at a special tribute concert for Foo Fighters drummer Taylor Hawkins. Sir Paul McCartney, Liam Gallagher and Queen were among those who paid tribute. The Foo Fighters also performed for one special song, and they were accompanied on the drums by Hawkins' teenage son Shane. The BBC's Mark Savage was there.
It's times like these to give and give.
Dave Grohl struggled to keep his composure as he played the Foo Fighters' first gig since Taylor Hawkins' death in March.
Learn to love again.
It was an all-star tribute concert that featured Hawkins' favourite artists, from AC/DC to Paul McCartney.
Don't you want me to love you?
But above all, it was a family affair. And towards the end of the night, the drummer's teenage son Shane took his father's place behind the kit for an emotionally charged version of My Hero.
Yeah, pretty sad, that one. Let's get to some of your feedback before we head off. Lots on the situation in Rotorua. This listener says, as a first home buyer in Rotorua, the number of overcrowded rental homes on the market was shocking. Motels are a symptom. Lack of affordable rentals is the cause. Denise has got in touch to say, I worked with agencies to place families in private rentals here in Rotorua, but no longer take these families on as they don't get the support from the agencies working with them that they need. Many of these families do not have the basic skills of running a home or living peacefully in a neighbourhood. Very sad that there are these people in Aotearoa that have become this way. Someone else says, surely the motel owners who have a guaranteed income for the past couple of years have some responsibility to ensure that their tenants are looking after their units. One listener says, in Wairaka, Auckland, it is very obvious that social housing is being built. It is amazing, but the process takes a lot longer than 3 years. Someone else comments that you'll never resolve the problem of homelessness, addiction and crime until you restore the family as the primary unit of society. If every child was born into a caring, nurturing and positive role modelling family, all of the above problems would be reduced by at least 70% and the cost of running government would reduce by at least $10 billion a year. Not sure where those figures have come from, but I get your point. On the subject of AUT and the job losses there, this person says, we have a major problem in many of our primary schools about ignoring the arts curriculum, too much focus on well-being, not realising that music, drama and art help with being creative and expanding our nation's learning. As part of the curriculum, about time the government stood up and showed support in that direction. Our young are our future. That is about all we have got time for. Don't forget, the late news team will be on deck to keep you updated throughout the night, so stay tuned. And if you missed anything on the program, you can find Checkpoint on Spotify, Apple or wherever you get your podcasts from. Ko te kaupapa tuatahi a pōpō, and tomorrow from 5 a.m, first up is live in the UK as the new British Prime Minister is announced. I'm sure they'll have a drum roll for that one. Kei te hoki mai anō a pōpō whānau pō Māori. Have a great night and we'll catch you again tomorrow.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. The Union for Tertiary Staff believes Auckland University of Technology's proposal to cut 230 jobs is short-sighted and will not help to rebuild the economy. The Maori Party says the tenants of emergency housing in Rotorua are owed answers as concerns are raised about the quality of their motel accommodation. The police will have new powers to seize assets worth more than $30,000 if they were paid for with the proceeds